Hello, my name is Michael and I'm going to analyse the paper Corruption and Economic Growth, New Empirical Evidence. Obviously, as an economics student, the topic was interesting to me, and since I've never studied it, the article immediately stood out. Ultimately, it proved to reinforce much of my beliefs, but challenged some of my preconceived notions, such as the effects of corruption being universal. One of the principal arguments in this article is that previous articles about corruption use flawed data. To give context to this claim, there are three main measurements of corruption, and you can see them on the screen now. But CPI is the favoured one. The ICRG is about international investment and how corruption threatens investment, and is therefore slightly inferior to a direct measure of corruption, while the WGI has been criticised for having methodological issues associated with it. In short, CPI is the best method for measuring corruption. However, before 2012, which is when methodological changes were made, CPI was not suitable for gathering information about changes made by corruption, since it wasn't able to be measured across time, as the value of a nation's CPI was an aggregate across a non-standard amount of time, meaning that data would reoccur or be incorrectly weighted. Despite this, most articles about the effects of corruption ignore this limitation and therefore have unsupported conclusions. This article of new data was made in 2019, so of course it uses all available data, which in this case is from 2012 to 2018. So what does the data actually say? Well, if corruption has a negative correlation with growth, that means that as corruption increases, growth decreases, and vice versa. However, there is a positive correlation between growth and corruption. As corruption increases, so does growth. Now, old data, as seen in the table, suggested that a positive correlation may have existed in some cases, but the newer data suggest otherwise, as seen on the diagram on the right. More specific, however, the data found that as corruption increased by 19.56 points of CPI, which is one standard deviation, the real GDP per capita would fall by 4.1% in the short run and have a cumulative fall of 17% in the long run. The data is quite robust and trustworthy for two reasons. Firstly, because they use a significant level of 1%, so it's incredibly unlikely there's no correlation whatsoever. But secondly, for the sake of academic rigour, the values of ICRG were used and the models were compared to see if there would be a substantial difference. It was found that the values given by using the IM from ICRG were slightly smaller, but the same to two significant figures, both 4.1% in the short run, and again, for the sake of accuracy, both are statistically significant to the 1% level. Additionally, previous models with old data suggested that the correlation between growth and corruption may be nonlinear. However, using the newer data didn't support this, and you can see that represented graphically now using both CPI and ICRG for increased accuracy. Interestingly, that data seems to suggest that a low level of corruption is more conducive to real GDP per capita than having no corruption. However, no theory as to why that is given in the article. Now, the study does have some flaws in it, but its flaws are mainly in representation of data rather than methodological issues. For example, they determined if a country's neighbouring nations are corrupt, then the initial country has a higher likelihood of being corrupt. The graphical representation of that uses categories that are too broad. You'll be able to see in the key on the bottom left that everything from 0 to 40 on CPI is shown as solid blue, and that's nearly half of all possible values, which is far too broad. However, despite these representational flaws, the article does ultimately provide a strong framework for empirically showing the effects of corruption on economic growth. The new data, ultimately, allows for the negative externalities and costs of corruption to be better represented, allowing more informed decisions to be made, both now and when improving and indeed making economic models and equations in the future. Thank you for watching. I hope you learned something.